Welcome to the Marketplace Midland podcast, where we highlight a monthly speaker that shares helpful tools for all of us to integrate timeless biblical principles into our modern businesses.
Welcome, guys. I'm Ken Beatty. I get the privilege of introducing our speaker, Dave Kuhnert, today, because I have worked with Dave for about 13 years now at Crown Quest. You know, the way these things usually go is somebody gets up, and it's usually somebody who knows the speaker, right, and kind of reads their resume. I chose not to go that way. If you want to see Dave's resume, he's got a great one, and it was in your invitation. And if you're looking at it and reading it off the page, you'll probably retain more of it anyway. So that's great. Another way I thought about going was just to make fun of Dave. There's a couple of really good reasons for that. Number one, there's tons of material there. Number two, it would have given you a flavor for the culture that we have at Crown Quest, and that's a culture that Dave had a huge hand in creating. But instead, I'm just going to tell you that Dave had a very distinguished, again, the details are in your invitation, a very distinguished 23-year military career that included many deployments and also in the midst of it getting an MBA. And then he came out to West Texas to join the effort at Crown Quest as titled production manager, but really also cultural leader and kind of instilling the culture of the company. Had a huge hand in that. Many of his, I think it's okay to use the word disciples, are here today. There's other people in this class who have taken Dave's leadership training. Dave took principles that we give a credit for kind of first getting from Herman Eben. Many of you know Herman, and to say that he ran with it is a huge understatement. Has had a huge impact locally, but also in all kinds of organizations that Dave has been able to touch over the years. Took the principles and wrote a servant leadership book. Maybe several of you have seen it. And like I say, it's impacted many other organizations as well. The only last thing I'll mention is that despite the fact that Dave is 6 months younger than me, I'll let you be the judge, but I look a lot better. With that, Dave Kuhnert.
Thank you, Ken, I guess, for those kind words. I know we're probably all tired of hearing Ken speak, so I'll go ahead and get started. Now, we're going to talk about culture today. And for culture, there's really three aspects of culture that I wanted to cover. The first, we're going to define culture, organizational culture, and what it is. Then we're going to talk about the immense power that culture has that we see in our society today. And then finally, we're going to dive into what it means to lead and shape culture. And you really can't talk about culture without getting into some of the larger issues that we're seeing in our society today and the grander culture. And some of these are pretty contentious that surround us today. So I'm going to hit on a lot of these very contentious hot button topics, a lot of them. And some of them you may not agree at. You may not agree with what I'm saying. It may make you feel a little angry or even a little icky, if you want to say that. And that's okay. That's okay to have these discussions. Believe it or not, it's okay. We can talk about this stuff and disagree on some things. It doesn't mean you have to burn my house down tonight. Okay? We don't have to go that route. So please don't do that. So talking about culture, we're going to start by defining culture. But before we do, there's a principle I want to talk about called acceptance versus approval. And what I'm talking about there's things I do every single day that God does not approve of and that you shouldn't approve of, but you can still accept me as a brother or sister in Christ, just as God accepts me as his child. There's things we all do that's not approved of, and that's okay. So I'm not here trying to separate us from people who think differently than us. We can not approve of actions and still accept people. So an organization is two or more people with a perceived common goal. Your family is an organization. Marketplace Midland, this is an organization. Your place of business is an organization. Midland and our country are all organizations. And anytime you put two or more people together, you can understand why no organization is perfect. Because whenever you have two or more people, there's always going to be some level of drama. Now, we all inherently recognize pretty much what a culture is, but we're going to define it as a shared language and a shared set of values. So the shared language is used to shape culture. We call that framing. We're going to talk a lot about that. But the whole shared set of values is it's what we honor and what we shame. Not what we say we honor and shame, but what we actually honor and shame. So in your organizations, or maybe in your family, you say, well, we honor good grades in our house. Well, how do you do that? It's not saying that is not honoring it. It's your actions. You can have a business that has the company values on the wall, enshrined on the wall, that nobody even knows what they are, because nobody follows those. Those are just for the business plan. Those are great words, but it's what you do, not what you say, that matters. It's what you actually honor and shame. Now, culture is going to exist intentionally or unintentionally. It's going to happen. You can either take the reins on it, or you can just let it happen and be something maybe you don't want it to be. And in our culture, it used to be that truth and virtue, they were kind of the same thing, right? If you were living in truth, that was virtuous. Now more than ever, those are kind of separated. If you're living in truth, you're not being virtuous. Living outside of reality, in many cases, is considered honorable. And when you choose to live counterculturally, living in truth, sometimes that causes culture to come for you, right? We've all heard of cancel culture, they call it. But ultimately, it's the greater society. They come for you when you talk about stuff that I'm about to talk about. So there's two types of culture. There's the blame culture, or the victim culture, sometimes we call it, and the create something or choice, the servant leadership culture. And if you look on the handout that I have there for you, on that top diagram, you can see the two different types of culture that I'm talking about. The triangle on the left, this is the self-serving, typical culture you find in any organization. It's the pyramid structure. You have the boss, and you've got some executives and some middle managers, all the way down to the newest member of the organization. And in this organization, everyone there exists to serve the person above them. And you know you have a blame culture when somebody makes a mistake and everybody looks around to figure out who to point the finger at. That's how you know you have a blame culture. The triangle on the right is the learning culture, the choice culture, the create something culture, where the leader, the mental model of the organization, the leader sees themselves in a position to serve everyone else in the organization. In this organization, we use structure to create the culture. So the structure is, what do we honor and what do we shame? That's going to shape your culture. That is going to inform the behavior of the people in the culture that are going to get your results. So if you don't have the results you want, you got to go back to resetting the structure. What are we honoring and what are we shaming? So those are the two types of culture. And then if you look at the diagram below that second diagram there, this is the circle on the left is the victim culture. This is where life, people, and circumstances are happening to me. Everything's happening to me, and this is what psychologists call an external locus of control. I have no agency. I am a victim because of could be an immutable kind of thing that we all have. It could be color of your skin, your economic standing. It could be you just don't feel like something bad's happened to me and there's nothing I can do to overcome it. Well, the only way to move out of that victim circle is to choose to move to that circle on the right, where you decide you can impact life, people, and circumstances. That's the answer. Henry Ford said, if you believe you can or you believe you can't, you're right. Well, this language that I'm talking about that is going to shape culture, it's used very intentionally today. You'll hear things like, hey, you deserve a break today. You just got to love yourself more. Well, I promise you love yourself more than enough. Try loving somebody else more. But politicians are really good at using this framing. They use this all the time. Some of the bills and what they get named, the Build Back Better plan. I don't know what's built or better or back, but it doesn't seem like anything. The Patriot Act. How could I be against the Patriot Act? but it spies on its own citizens. Black Lives Matter. How can I be against something so true? Birthing person instead of mother. All of these are instances of using language to shape culture. Now, culture can be impacted negatively through indifference, and this happens all the time. You may have heard of the Overton window. If you haven't, the Overton window is the amount of time it takes from something for when we go from outrage to celebration. So it looks something like this. Something happens and everybody's outraged. They're absolutely appalled that this action took place. And then it happens enough times again where people become indifferent. And this is the problem, the indifferent stage. Because when it happens again, it becomes acceptable. And once it becomes acceptable, it's just the next natural step is for us to celebrate it. And if you don't celebrate it, well, what happens? You get labeled. You get shamed with those words, whether it be racist, homophobe, whatever it may be. You will get labeled if you don't celebrate with them. Culture, this Overton window, this is happening at a more rapid pace than ever before in history. With the advent of the social media, TikTok, Facebook, and the 24-hour news cycle, that Overton window is just compressed. The amount of time it takes to go from outrage to celebrated is faster than ever before. I'll give you an example. In the 1960s, we had a cultural phenomenon called the sexual revolution. The sexual revolution, what it taught us, or what it was tried to tell us, inform us of, is that women have to act like men to have value. And this is still threaded through our culture today, where you'll see people shame women for not having a career, for not being out there working full time, or they'll honor women for doing that, and they'll shame them for staying home. They'll shame them for being a housekeeper or a mother or even homeschooling. It's more honorable to be out there in the workforce. And that took about 15 to 20 years to really settle in. Fast forward to today, and on October 7th of 2023, Hamas, a terrorist organization, comes across the border of Israel. They kill, murder, torture, rape, and burn 2,500 citizens. And then they capture 250 more. 1,200 citizens and capture 250 more. And they take them back into Palestine. The world was outraged, right? Everybody was, this is ridiculous. A few days later, people started to become indifferent. A little while later, it became acceptable. And now, what you see in some places is this celebration taking place. You see it on college campuses right now. 6 months later is all it took. And now across universities in our country, where we evidently teach activism instead of education, we have an attempt to shift our culture in a different direction. From the river to the sea, death to America, advocating for the elimination of Israel. That's how fast it's moving right now. That's how fast culture is moving. So an organizational culture, an organization, 2 or more people with the perceived common goal, we have a shared language and a shared set of values, what we honor and what we shame. It's extremely powerful. So let's talk about how powerful culture can be. We know what we believe, but why do we believe it? Well, we all have these cultural influences around us, whether it comes from family, hopefully your religion, or some social groups. It's one of the most powerful forces we deal with. Think of your first day in any new organization, maybe your first day on the job. When you show up to that new job, what are you doing? You're looking around and observing behavior. What is honored and what is shamed? You're observing behavior to figure out how do you fit into this whole organizational culture that they may have. Well, culture's so powerful, it can even get us to live outside of reality, can it? Like I mentioned earlier, truth and virtue were the same. They were synonymous, and now they've drifted apart in many places in our country. And you can see this in several of these hot button topics I'm about to talk about. But before I do, I want to remind you of acceptance versus approval. Now, you may hear things like, well, if you don't approve of my actions, then you don't accept me. No, that's a you problem, not a me problem. I can still accept you and not approve of some of your behavior. That's a blame victim culture mentality. So some of these hot button topics. They're all contentious because it creates a victim. It pushes that victim status. It takes away choice and freedom. It creates groups of people that expect special entitlement based on what culture tells them they have no agency over, that external locus of control. So what are some of these topics? First one let's talk about is critical theory. You've probably heard of critical race theory. The letter in the middle, the CRT, the R isn't the problem. There's a real discussion we can have about race in our country, absolutely. It's the C and the T, critical theory. And all critical theory does is try to tell us that there's an oppressor and there's an oppressed. And if you're not in the oppressed category, you're an oppressor. So with critical race theory, you're white and you're an oppressor, or you're not white and you're oppressed. And there's nothing you can do to change that. Now, this is a Marxist idea of pitting people against one another. It divides instead of uniting. It creates and promotes that oppressor-oppressed culture or perspective. And this can be on anything. You could put an E in the middle, critical economic theory, and call it rich versus poor. Gender, male, you're an oppressor. Female, you're oppressed. Nothing you can do about it. Your gender identity, as they like to call it, how you feel that day. If you don't feel like the gender you were born into, then you're oppressed. You get to find yourself as a victim, and that can be seen as honorable. So critical theory, the culture warriors, what they want to do is take this critical theory lens and apply it to all these other hot button topics that we have in our society. So let's look at LGBTQ. 4% of baby boomers identified as lesbian, bi, gay, trans, whatever all the letters mean. 4% said they were in that category. Fast forward 2 generations to our millennials, 13% said they were in that category. Then the very next generation, this is Gen Z, this is our college age and working class kids coming into the workforce now. Gen Z, 36% identify as LGBT or Q. Now you can do the research on this and you'll see things as low as 25% and as high as 40-some%. And a recent survey at Brown University, 40%, this is in 2023, said they belong to that community, LGBTQ. This means we're all within 1 degree of separation. Either you yourself identify as that, you're related to someone, or at least know someone, where the baby boomer generation may have known someone who knew someone. So this is very prevalent. So does this sound real? I mean, can we go from 4% to 40% in 3 generations? So how do we know this isn't true? How do we know that they're not just saying this to fit in? Well, we know that because the number one demographic of girls who are getting pregnant out of wedlock are girls who identify as lesbians. In fact, if you're a girl who identifies as a lesbian, you're 7 times more likely to get pregnant out of wedlock than your straight counterpart. That sounds crazy when I say that, doesn't it? Why would people do that? It's because what we honor and what we shame. This is the power of culture. When you honor something, you get more of it. That's how it works. However, there are consequences to living outside of reality. If you identify as lesbian, gay, or bi, you are 2 times more likely to commit suicide or have suicidal ideations than your straight counterpart. 70% of this group, when surveyed, reported being sad or despondent. Those are just some of the consequences. How about on the trans subject? Well, boys and girls are different. We have testosterone and estrogen progesterone. And what they would call onset gender dysphoria, which we would just say gender confusion. Groups of friends, this happens almost simultaneously, but more so with girls than boys. So if you have girls, pay special attention to what I'm about to say, because in the last decade, the diagnosis of girls that get diagnosed with this gender confusion increased by over 4,000% in the last 10 years. When one girl in a friend group tends to identify, they all do. Why? Because we have people in their lives that tell them that's honorable. Oh, Susie, she's so brave. She came out today. Well, I want to be brave. That's what that causes. I want to be honored. Well, the data indicates that 93% of children who identify incorrectly as genderly confused, 93% will outgrow it by the time they're 18. And yet we'll have parents that start the medication process, if they want to call it medication. 30% of those who make it to the age of 18 and decide that they want to continue that transition try to detransition later in life. The consequences for living outside of reality, if you're identify as a member of that community, 5 times more likely to commit suicide or have suicidal ideations. When you're prescribed these medications, such as puberty blockers, they're extremely damaging and have numerous permanent side effects. But this is the power of culture. This is how powerful it is. What are we honoring? If we honor confusion, we get confusion. Role models have a big role to play in all of this, don't they? These are extremely powerful influences in our life. This is what we would call referent influence. And when surveyed, kindergarten through 12th graders, the number 1 role model, parent or grandparent. Number 2, teacher or coach. So when your child's entering puberty, they don't feel comfortable in their own skin, and they're going to a teacher or coach who may be confused about all of this. They might suggest it's because, well, maybe you were born actually as the opposite gender in the body that you're in. That's going to play a significant role in their decision making. Well, what child feels completely in control and comfortable in their own skin during puberty? Especially with girls, this is just a fact. And when role models are pushing in that direction, that's going to cause a problem. Well, gender, is it a social construct or is it a biological fact? That's the two sides of this. You can see what people say, oh, it's a spectrum. But the reality is it's in your DNA. It's in your bones. When they dig you up 1,000 years from now, they can tell you whether you're a male or a female. They can tell anybody that. Now, there is a group out there trying to get anthropologists to not identify bones as male or female because we don't know how they identified. But boys are born with 2,500 to 3,000% more testosterone than girls. That's going to cause some differences. So if you're a low T male, you still have 2,500% more testosterone than a female. Now, females have some testosterone as well. It's just much lower. It's an X and an X chromosome versus an X and a Y chromosome. Testosterone does some amazing things to us. As boys, it separates the hemispheres of the brain in the womb. I mean, sometimes you think our brains split apart or something because of the way we act. But what it does is it causes for things for us not to be connected. So we get to see the tree. We can be very focused, but we'll often miss the forest. And for women, what this gets to happen for them is everything's connected for them. They can see the big picture, but sometimes they can't see the focus part. So they can see the forest and not the tree. Well, when we put both of these together within our design, what do we get? Now we get oneness. We can help each other with all of this. I can help her see the tree, and she can help me see the forest. This is awesome. We're designed differently to create unity through diversity. Different parts of the same body, right? The body of Christ. The sexual revolution asserts women need to act more like men to have value, degrading that high, lofty position that God gave women. And now men are told, you have to be more androgynous or more like a woman to not be toxic. And that degrades the calling that God placed on men. Men and women have equal value but different roles. We know this. Only women can have babies, and that's just a fact. But it takes men to get that ball rolling in the right direction, doesn't it? So, other difference between men and women. Women express themselves through words and men through actions. Women will use over 27,000 words a day. For context, you take about 22,000 breaths a day. Men, less than 7,000 words a day. You can see this from a really young age. Watch Johnny and Susie play. At a very young age, Susie will have 2 dolls, one in each hand, and they'll both have names, and they'll both have careers, and they'll have babies, and it's na. She'll learn to use her words from a very, very young age. Johnny is probably in speech therapy, like most of us had to go through, and he uses one word all day when playing with his car, doesn't he? Vroom. That's all you get out of Johnny. Boys don't express themselves through words. That's just how it works. The difference between testosterone and estrogen and progesterone. In fact, now men of the year are now women, aren't they? You seen this in Newsweek and Time Magazine? Men are now women of the year. We're appropriating female culture, I guess. So where does this lead? Well, anything that's a social construct will go as far as culture will allow it, and then just a little bit further. There are no limits. If it's not a biological fact and it's a social construct, it'll go as far as culture will allow it, and then just a little bit further, beyond what is acceptable, which allows us to be whatever I feel like. You can look up furries. I won't get into furries, but I've seen this with my own eyes, people who want to identify as animals. That's where that leads. It leads to us being captives to our own feelings, no longer free to make choices. This is the immense power that culture has. Right now, you might be feeling a little uneasy just being in a room with somebody even talking about this stuff because it just kind of feels icky. This is just the power of culture that we're talking about. Those advocating these adverse beliefs shame anyone willing to oppose them. That's how they want culture to work. But they do so in ways that are effective because they're using that language, that framing to make it all happen, to shape the culture through organized campaigns. So social constructs. We can look at marriage. Is marriage a social construct or is it an institution sanctioned by God? Well, if it's an institution sanctioned by God, then marriage is between a man and a woman. If it's a social construct, then a boy and a boy can be married. A girl and a girl can be married, or a boy who feels like a girl, or you get where I'm going with this. But if it's a social construct, where does it end? Where does it end? You can marry whomever or whatever you would like, is where that goes. Watch over the next 5 years this movement we have in our country right now in polyamory, having more than one partner, and how that's going to shift into polygamy. Watch the social pressure we start to see with that. So where does it end? What's acceptable, and where should this standard come from? Well, as Christians, we should say Scripture because God, He designed it all. He knows how it works best. Our goal should be human flourishing. And we gain human flourishing simply through elevating what works, what He designed for us and what works. The topic of abortion. There's 3 lives involved here. There's the life of the mother, the life of the father, and the life of the child. Is it a lump of cells or is it an unborn baby? 99.5% of biologists, when surveyed, said life begins at conception. Over 2,000 biologists surveyed. The other 0.5% wouldn't answer the question in this survey because it's used by people like me in talks like this. Now, certainly women, unfortunately, can bear the unfair burden that results in an unwanted relationship or in a relationship with an unwanted child. Certainly, we all know that happens. Men should do more, but that's not the child's fault. In the U.S., a number of states allow abortion up until the moment of birth. This is opposed by a supermajority of Americans, but it still happens in many states. There's only 5 other countries in the world that have the same policy on abortion. Prior to the overturn of Roe versus Wade, we fell in with these 5 countries: China, North Korea, South Korea, Canada, and Vietnam. We're the only 5 countries in the world that have no limit on abortion. Now, there's a lot of variance among the states in how this is handled, but there's still many that allow abortion up until the time of birth. Abortion is not women's health care. That's the framing. That's the language being used to shift the culture. It's way more safe for a woman to have a baby than to abort a baby. And then, of course, what the media doesn't talk about, the consequences for this down the road are tremendous. The emotional and mental and physical consequences that can happen to the woman later in life. Now, the elites have campaigned to shift our culture on this topic. It went from abortion is evil, we became indifferent, it became acceptable, and a few years ago, if you remember, it was even celebrated. We were lighting up buildings in some of the cities advocating for abortion. There are consequences for living outside reality. Period. In 2022, this is the most recent survey we have, over 49,000 Americans committed suicide. That's the highest number ever recorded. This does not include accidental drug overdoses, which was also at an all-time high, by the way. Most of these were men. This caused life expectancy for men to drop for the first time since 1917 during World War I and the Spanish-American flu combined. Other than that, life expectancy for men has continued to go up until 2022. Number one reason, lack of purpose. Finding my place in today's culture. Where do I fit in? This is difficult. The victim culture tells you have no agency and you're a victim. Whenever you live outside your design or truth, there are always going to be consequences. Now, our culture honors this victim status. If you're a victim, you have a voice that sometimes matters more than somebody that's not a victim. If you're a victim or an extreme advocate for their victim status, you're the oppressor, right? If you're not an advocate for them, if you're not a victim, you're an oppressor. That's that critical theory. So in some cases, you're an oppressor even when you are an advocate for the victim because you don't have the right skin color or gender orientation. And this leads to identity politics where I am my gender, I am my race, I am my sexual preference. Well, should politics influence our religion, or should our religion inform our politics? Or is your politics your religion? Where should our identity come from? It's not in who we choose to have sex with. It comes from God, not some political ideology. We don't need social constructs to tell us who we are. We have a book for that. There's several more cultural topics I could go on and on about, like the anti-human climate change agenda, the border stuff, but they're all the same. They're all the same. There's a victim and there's an oppressor. And you see the policy is always going to follow culture. Chuck Colson used to talk about that. So culture is an organizational culture, two or more people with the perceived common goal, shared language, shared values. What are we honoring and what are we shaming? It's extremely powerful. It causes us to even live outside of reality. That's powerful. So how do we lead? How do we shape culture? Well, it's way easier to do when you're starting an organization. If you're starting a family, it's a lot easier to start that family with the right values. What are you going to honor and what are you going to shame? If you're starting a business, start it up front. Be intentional, because if you're unintentional with your culture, you're still going to have a culture. But you might end up with that blame culture, that victim culture, because there's a lot of external pressure to move in that direction. So we want to be really intentional with the culture that we're going to have. You're going to need clarity. You have to cast that vision of what you're trying to do if you want to have that choice, that truth culture. Changing a culture, now that's a slow ship to turn. That's a lot harder. You're starting a new job and going into a large organization, it's going to be a little more difficult. But you can do it, and we're called to do it. We are called to share truth. Scripture talks about sharing truth 333 times. I'll give you a few of them. Zechariah 8:16. These are the things which you should do. Speak the truth to one another. Judge with truth and judgment for peace in your gates. Ephesians 4:25. Having put away falsehood, let each one of you speak the truth with his neighbor, for we are members of one another. 1 Corinthians 13:6. Love does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. So what's wrong with just affirming? I don't want to have the conflict. What's wrong with just affirming instead of sharing truth? Well, because enabling others to live outside reality, not being good for them, wasn't common sense enough. We have some more research coming out that will come out early this year, next couple of months, from over 3 different continents that shows us that when you enable people to live outside of reality, it exacerbates the problem. It compounds the issue. It increases the rates of suicide and depression and mental health problems. That should probably not a surprise to any of you. But if you know the facts, if you know some of these numbers on these hot button topics that we're dealing with in our society, and don't be indifferent about them. Don't go from just being upset about it to being indifferent. That's the problem right there. Culture's got where it is simply because of the indifference. You're outraged, and then you became indifferent. This is what we did. A lot of areas in our culture are the way they are today because we allowed it to be. We let it happen. That's that Overton window. There's a lot of passion for change out there on both sides here. And this becomes a movement, but it works both ways. When you start looking at some of these key positions in universities and schools and in government, all of these are extremely influential. So to change culture is going to require intentionality and leadership. Leadership, we're going to say, is just simply influence. But you've got to use your influence to shape culture. We all have influence. Knowing how to use the language to help you is really important. That framing of the issues. Never accept your opponent's framing. We see this in Scripture. You can look at Matthew 22, where the Pharisees kind of got together and they thought they finally figured out how to trap Jesus. And they sent some folks to him in front of a group of people. And they asked him, should we pay taxes to Rome? Now, this is a trap. There's no right answer. Answer yes, and all of the zealots and all the people that were following him would have quit following him. And they knew that. Aha, got him. Or if he says, no, we shouldn't pay taxes to Rome, then he's against Rome and we can put him to death. So they figured out how to get him. Jesus recognized the framing. He recognized what they were actually saying. And he says to them, why do you test me? And then he goes on, render to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. He recognized it right away and twisted it around on him with a beautiful answer and turned it all upside down. That's the example that we get to follow. So know the issues, recognize the framing that's involved. Additionally, you have to vote. This last election that we just had, single-digit percentage of registered voters in Midland voted for city council. These are the more important elections. Everybody wants to vote for the presidential election, and that's important. But when it comes to judges and local politicians, that's where it starts to happen in your community. Know who's running and what platform they're running on. Do you want a judge sitting on the bench that's going to advocate for the transition of children? That will take your kids away if you're not supporting that, like you see in California? Or do you want somebody that's going to sit up there and call that child abuse? That's the choice you get to make. But if you don't use your voice, if you don't use your influence, it doesn't change. You got to win the framing. We all have a sphere of influence. What we honor and what we shame. Know what you value and compete on those values. Now, I'm not talking about necessarily going to Austin or Washington, D.C. and holding some sign. I'm talking about something a lot harder. It's talking to your crazy uncle who has some of these beliefs of living outside of reality. Your own family, loving them enough to share truth with them. Your sphere of influence, that's where we're losing when we don't take the time, have the passion, and the courage to even talk to our own families about this. Don't react to bad framing. When you start to have these conversations, that's what's going to happen. They're going to throw those bumper sticker slogans out there. Know the facts. Know the facts. Changing culture, it's going to require listening. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason, that's famously said. You don't have to let these topics turn into a discussion of somebody else of another viewpoint to some emotional upheaval. Just listen and ask questions. That's all you have to do. The lies will unravel simply by asking questions. Now, questions we don't want to ask are why. We want to know why, but we can't ask why. Why is a very implicating question. Why do you feel like that? Now I have to defend my thesis. Why did you do it that way? Now I have to defend why I did it that way. Tell me more about. How did you come to that conclusion? Where's your research to back that up? How do you know that's true? Don't ask why. We want them to be objective. Why makes it subjective. Now they're in the moment and they're going to defend their thesis. So don't ask why. They know what they believe for the same reasons that you believe what you believe. They've been influenced by culture and the family or their religion or the people around them. So ask yourself, how can I turn this statement into a question and not the why question? Questions help keep them talking about the topic where it moves past those bumper sticker slogans. Other than espousing something Bill Maher said or they heard on CNN or some politician is espousing. It helps us move beyond that. How do you know that's true? Tell me more about that. These are great questions. How did you come to that conclusion? Where does life begin? When does a baby get its soul? Tough questions to answer if you're in that camp. Have you ever seen Matt Walsh's documentary, What is a Woman? That's all he does. He goes around and asks a question. Simply asks a question. And it causes it all to unravel in a comedic way. You can do the same thing. Just ask the question. Don't let it become emotional. They may get mad. They may become emotional. They may walk away. Happens very frequently when I have conversations like this. It's not my job to convince them, but it is my job to share truth. I may be planting a seed that someone else will water down the road. But if I don't even have the courage to plant the seed, all the water in the world won't help. This is going to create, you're going to need empathy and understanding just to make this happen, so a lot of listening. And there's hope here. Have you heard of the Solomon Asch conformity experiments? This is a very famous experiment they did on people. And what they do is they put people around a table, so you might have 15 people around a table, and they'll ask a very specific but easy question to answer. What's 5 plus 5? And they'll go around the table, and everyone will give a wrong answer. And then the person who's being experimented on is the only one at the table looking around. And when everybody else gives a wrong answer, 30% of the time, they'll say the wrong answer as well. Even though they know the answer is 10. 100% sure of what the answer is, they'll say a different answer. But when they did the experiment and they put one other person in there with the correct answer, in less than 5% of the situations did that same person ever say something than the truth. All it takes, one other person to say the truth. And then the truth is out there. Then we can convince people. So when we understand what culture is, we know how to define it and what's happening with it. We understand the immense power behind it. We can start to shape it and move it from victim and blame to choice in creating. We can make truth and virtue synonymous again, simply by understanding this stuff. I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It's going to take empathy. It's going to take courage. It's going to take conviction and commitment and time. But through leadership, we can influence our culture, value, and honor in the right direction once again. If we'll just have the courage to be outspoken instead of the silent majority, we can make this happen. Now, I gave a lot of stats today, and you're like, man, that sounds like a lot of made-up stuff. Well, if you're interested in where some of the stuff, I got some books up here. You can take a picture of the books. But other great resources, Breakpoint podcast, if you're familiar with Breakpoint or the Colson Center. If you go on the Colson Center website, they have something called the Identity Project. Absolutely tremendous. Focus on the Family, great resource to help you find some of this stuff. Even some of these stats, the government will put them out. The CDC or the American Psychology Association, they're there. You might have to do some digging on the government websites because they try to hide it. But it's all out there. Real research that's done, and it's just kind of pushed off. So feel free to take advantage of those resources. And if you want to learn more about influence and leadership, we're going to do another servant leadership class. It's completely free, starting June 11th. We do it in the evenings. It's for you, for your spouses. And it's just simply leadership and influence. We'll talk about this cultural stuff. It's from 6 to 8 p.m. If you'd like to attend or have questions about it, my email is on the handout there. And also that QR code, you can scan that with your phone and that'll take you to our website. A lot of great resources there as well. And I think now we're going to go for a few minutes of table discussion, and then we'll do some question and answer if we have some time. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Marketplace Midland podcast.